Okay, so I think now at this point we probably have a fairly good understanding of what social disorganization is actually saying, how it can be implemented. So let's talk a little bit more about like the practicalities of this theory. So keep in mind that this theory is often trying to explain variations in crime differences across the cities and neighborhoods, right? And one of the tricky things that often comes up is, neighborhood definition. Like if I said to you guys, like what exactly is your neighborhood? What do you think, that all encompasses, right? If I asked all of you that question, each of you would give me a very different answers. Is it just a couple blocks? Is it the subdivision? Is it the apartment complex? Is it the surrounding areas involved, right? So it becomes very difficult to pinpoint like what exactly is a neighborhood and how it impacts people, right? Because depending on one's perception of the neighborhood, is really going to affect you, like whether someone has any say into what goes on in the neighborhood, whether or not they're a good regulator or actor and things like that, right? So it really becomes kind of an issue in terms of measurement about like what is a neighborhood and how do people perceive it, right? The other part to consider is that more often than not, a lot of like the measures that are being used indicate that poverty and deprivation and other forms of like social ills in certain neighborhoods equals more crime. The problem with measuring, so then people would say that, okay, because look, these are the indicators of areas like that are socially disorganized, therefore social disorganization predicts crime. The problem is that these measures of poverty only measure poverty and low income. Social disorganization doesn't necessarily say that poverty leads to more crime. It instead is stating that there's a breakdown of community communication, and that is what results into more crime. It's not necessarily like poverty itself or residential mobility itself or ethnic heterogeneity, right? It is the confluence of these factors leading to a breakdown of communication, leading to people being unlikely or unwilling to participate or correct in any kind of crime that really makes this an issue, right? So that's a big yawn. So keep in mind that this is always asking about communication and willingness to intervene into the behaviors and actions of the community or neighborhood that someone lives in, right? So when it comes to like a testing, perspective, right, this becomes much more difficult because it's like what exactly is going to work, how and why does something do or does not work? How do we actually map, like what exactly is going on? The other part that's important to consider is like from a policy perspective, right? So just social disorganization predicts breakdowns in communication fundamentally lead to more different variations in breakdowns in communication lead to more crime, right? So from a policy perspective, the goal is to get more communication and stronger bonds in a neighborhood. So the problem is, while it sounds good, like how exactly do you motivate or lead to community organization? Especially when there are going to be competing demands for that, right? Depending on a neighborhood, the most powerful forces could be, some gang that's in an area or, homeowners association or something like that, right? But that may not be fully represent the views of an area. Similarly, right, when you have these conflicting views, how do you say, hey, these views work and you should leave us alone or do as I say, when others, really aren't willing to do that, right? So you create like this problem because what exactly is going to work, why and how, and what exactly do you do about it, right? So it creates this whole mess. Then is that the policy is going to say strengthen the neighborhood, but it's not necessarily strengthen the neighborhood to clean it up, right? Like while that is like good and right of itself, that's like fine, right? Does that mean get more opportunities? Sure, maybe it does, right? So people focus on that, but that doesn't resolve the the outstanding issue of like community communication being important and stuff. The other part to consider too is that does a willingness to intervene, we'll call it WTI, need to be there to prevent crime. Do these need to be publicly communicated directions? Do people have to intervene, in that place, right? Like I live in an apartment complex, and the truth is, like I don't talk to my neighbors, and that has been true for me from the last 4 places I've lived, where just like no contact with neighbors other than the polite hello or something like that. So at that point, does it really matter then if we have that place? If we really have people coming in, does it really matter if we're able to get through or not? Does it matter? Is that what the other key is, or is it something else altogether? So it really becomes an issue then. It's like, are there good policy implications related to social disorganization? Especially when there are conflicting values and goals, right? Like that really becomes kind of a problem. The other part is like, so much of it requires people to intervene on the lives of others, and that leads to some discussions about, is that something that we want? Do we want to live in a society where that kind of thing is acceptable and permissible? Or we have people bugging into our lives, or are we more content to ignore it, not let it happen, not let it bother us, and tell people to piss off, right? So there's always this balancing act of what is or is not going to work, and so on. So the other part too to consider is that from a precision standpoint, right, these concepts of social disorganization is not very clear, right? They say these other markers are indicators of social disorganization, but they aren't in and of themselves markers of it. So it's not a very clear theory. It makes it very difficult to test, along with the poor operationalization of these constructs, right? They're very poorly done, so testing is very difficult. The other part to consider too, if we start looking back and thinking about correlates, right, is that how would this explain biological sex? And the thing is, it really can't, right? There's not a good explanation coming out of this, unless you were supposed to say that in socially disorganized areas, men need more guidance or something. It's not a very good one, right? It does explain maybe differences with poverty, right? So we can find that crime tends to be more in areas of more poverty, and that's indicative of socially disorganized areas, so you could make that argument. The same would be true for people of different ethnic backgrounds, because people in areas with more poverty, there also tends to be people with more ethnic heterogeneous, so there's a lot more mixing of Black, Hispanic, Latinx, African American, Caribbean American, Asian, Muslim Americans, right? They all tend to be more clustered like that. And so you can explain, that kind of pattern, fairly easily. The other part to consider too is, how would this explain patterns across age in committing crime? So, from this perspective, then, age, are you assuming that people aren't willing to intervene in the lives of children? If it's a poorly socially disorganized area, there's not a village to watch children. Is that why, there's more crime, right? So there's more crime because, it takes a village to raise a child, and because the village isn't working, it doesn't, no one can intervene. Because is that what the argument is? Possibly. Who knows? The other part we'll also leave off with scope is, what crime does this explain? Is it just neighborhood crime? It certainly can't do like white collar crime. That would be, poorly there, unless you make the assertion that an office, is a form of community neighborhood and they allow crime to happen because they're passive to it. So I guess you could make that argument. That's okay. I don't know how good that is, but you could do it. You could also make the argument, we said, excuse me. You could also make the argument about, like, is this really effective? Is this all well and good? Does this explain, violent crimes? Does it explain property crimes? I think it'd be something that would be interesting if you guys explored more for yourself. But until then, I'm going to sign off and we'll close off this module.